To understand how genes can interact with the environment and in turn affect how anxious or stressed we feel, we need to step back into the land of the nervous system and the endocrine system. The human nervous system is made up of billions of nerve cells called neurons. Like all cells, they have a cell body called a soma, but neurons also have a bushy web of dendrites that allows them to receive messages from other neurons, and a long tail called an axon, which conducts an electrical signal down to its terminal button. The place where two neurons meet is called a synapse. Now, many people don't realise that neurons don't actually touch each other. It's not like the terminal button of one neuron is glued to the dendrite of another neuron. Instead, there's a teeny tiny microscopic gap between the two neurons called the synaptic cleft. To communicate with its neighbours, a neuron sends an electrical signal all the way down the length of its axon to the terminal button. When people talk about neurons firing, this is what they're talking about. The technical term for a neuron firing is an action potential. When the neuron has fired its action potential, this electrical signal triggers the release of neurotransmitters from the terminal button into the synaptic cleft. These neurotransmitters fit into receptors on the receiving neuron, a bit like a key in a lock. As we'll see later in the course, some neurotransmitters are excitatory and increase the receiving neuron's potential to fire, whilst others decrease the receiver's potential to fire and are known as inhibitory neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters don't hang out in the receptors indefinitely. Once they've done their excitatory or inhibitory business, they disconnect from the receptor and pop back up into the terminal button in a process known as reuptake. If you've ever heard of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, which are sometimes prescribed to people with depression, that's how these drugs work. They prevent the reuptake of serotonin, so the serotonin can hang out longer and have a longer lasting effect. But it's not just the individual neurons that control what we think, what we feel, and who we are. To understand that, we need to take a step back and look at the nervous system as a whole. The mammalian nervous system consists of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is literally everything else. The peripheral nervous system is itself made up of two parts: the somatic nervous system, which controls the voluntary skeletal muscles in your body, like your biceps and your eyebrows, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls automatic behaviours like contracting the muscles of your gut, your heart rate, and the nerves that control your endocrine system, which we'll talk about in a sec. The autonomic nervous system is, again, you guessed it, divided into two parts: the sympathetic nervous system, controlling the fight or flight response that prepares our body for action during times of stress, and the parasympathetic nervous system that just calms everything down again, so we're not permanently on edge and ready to fight bears. Like I said, the autonomic nervous system also controls another really important system in our bodies, the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a collection of glands scattered throughout the body, and they communicate with each other via chemical messages called hormones. These hormones are released into the bloodstream and bind to receptors that control a huge range of functions like metabolism, sex and reproduction, growth, development, and hunger. Two glands that we will talk about over and over again in this course are the pituitary gland and the adrenal glands. The pituitary gland sits at the base of your brain underneath a structure called the hypothalamus. When you or a baby rat experiences a stressful event, the hypothalamus releases hormones that tell the pituitary gland to release its own bunch of hormones. These hormones travel through the bloodstream and tell your adrenal glands to release hormones like cortisol that rapidly break down fat into sugar, giving you a quick hit of energy so you can fight off that bear. In the case of the neglected rat pups whose foster mamas were low leakers, that extra cortisol helped them fight off those scary lab technicians who were trying to feed them and change their bedding. Importantly, the cortisol also shuts off the stress response because, again, we don't want to be living our whole lives feeling on edge because we're flooded with stress hormones. So when the brain's cortisol receptors detect a high level of cortisol in the blood, it shuts off the stress response so we can calm down again. The more cortisol receptors you have in your brain, the faster the stress response is shut off and the faster you recover from feeling scared. This whole chain reaction from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to the adrenal glands is called the HPA axis. So what does the HPA axis have to do with rat mamas licking their foster babies? Well, the researchers found that the licking behaviour of the foster mothers had turned on and off literally hundreds of genes in the rat pups. Simply being licked had reprogrammed the way that the pup's DNA was being interpreted. So which genes were affected? You guessed it, the genes responsible for the brain's cortisol receptors, the same receptors that shut off the stress response. More licking turned on more genes that coded for more cortisol receptors. More receptors meant that the rat pup's brain could detect even tiny increases in cortisol and rapidly shut off the stress response, which helps them to stay calm under pressure. On the other hand, rats that weren't licked very much did not have as many genes turned on, and so they had fewer cortisol receptors. This meant that those rats needed to be flooded with much higher levels of stress hormones before their brains were able to shut off the stress response. And this made them constantly anxious and much more fearful when the staff were trying to handle them. By now, I hope you're getting the picture that all the body systems work together and with the environment to create not just mental illness, but everything about you. Psychologists say everything psychological is simultaneously biological. Without neurons and hormones, genes and the environment that you encounter, there are no emotions, there are no thoughts. There would be no you. And that, my friends, would be a travesty. So that was the second half of the biopsychosocial model's biological branch. We looked at neurons, neurotransmitters, the nervous system and the endocrine system, as well as how all these systems interact to produce the stress response. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the psychological part of the biopsychosocial model in emotions, learning and cognition.